This happened 3 winters ago, during a blizzard that people in my town still talk about like it was some kind of benchmark. The kind of storm you compare every other winter to. I was 31 at the time and living in northern Minnesota in a small logging town that barely shows up on most maps. I worked nights at a distribution warehouse just outside town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough, and more importantly, it was stable. Winters out there have a way of reminding you how important that is. The night the storm hit, no one thought it would be anything special. Snowstorms were just part of life. You learned to respect them, but you didn't panic every time the forecast said heavy snowfall. The radio mentioned high winds and reduced visibility, but nothing that sounded apocalyptic. I clocked in at 6 p.m. like usual, joked with a couple coworkers about how bad the roads might get, and didn't give it another thought. By 9 p.m., everything had changed. The wind started howling so loudly against the warehouse walls that we had to raise our voices just to hear each other. Snow was blowing sideways, slamming into the loading bay doors hard enough to make them rattle. The overhead lights flickered once, then twice. About half an hour later, the power went out completely. Emergency lights kicked on, bathing the warehouse in this dull red glow that made everything feel wrong. Management tried calling it in, but cell service was already getting spotty. After about 20 minutes of standing around, the supervisor made the call to shut everything down and send us home before conditions got even worse. That should have been my cue to feel relieved. Instead, I felt this quiet knot forming in my stomach. By the time I stepped outside, the parking lot was barely recognizable. The plows hadn't been able to keep up, and fresh snow was already filling in their tracks. My car was somewhere out there, but it took me a minute just to find it. When I finally did, I brushed off the windshield, climbed inside, and tried to start the engine. Nothing. I tried again. The engine turned over once, weakly, and then died. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the wind scream around the car. I tried one more time, knowing it wouldn't work. It didn't. I checked my phone. No signal, not even enough to send a text. Most of my coworkers had already left, their taillights disappearing into the whiteout one by one. The warehouse itself was dark now, just a massive shadow behind me. I was officially alone. I had 2 options: stay in my car and hope someone came back, or try to get home on foot. Under normal conditions, my apartment was about a mile away. A straight walk down the service road, then through a small residential stretch. I'd walked it before in decent weather. But this wasn't decent weather. This was the kind of storm that erased landmarks and turned familiar places into blank space. Still, staying in the car felt worse. I didn't know how cold it was going to get, and without the engine running, the car wouldn't hold heat for long. I grabbed my coat, pulled my hood tight, wrapped a scarf around my face, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit me immediately, like a physical force. It stole my breath and burned my exposed skin. Snow found its way into my boots within seconds. Visibility was maybe 10 feet at best. The warehouse disappeared behind me almost instantly. I kept walking. At first, I focused on counting my steps, telling myself that if I just kept moving forward, I'd eventually hit the road. The world felt incredibly small. Just me, the sound of my breathing, and the endless roar of the wind. After maybe 10 minutes, something started to feel off. I should have reached the service road by then, even accounting for slower movement. I'd walked this distance too many times to misjudge it that badly, but all I could see was snow. No road, no fence line, no signposts. I stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, trying to orient myself. That's when I realized something terrifying. My footprints were already gone. The snow was filling them, and almost as fast as I was making them. It was like I'd never been there at all. The sense of direction I'd been clinging to evaporated in that moment. I pulled out my phone again. Still no signal. The battery was draining faster than it should have in the cold. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, the sound of snow shifting, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate, crunching through snow. They weren't my footsteps. I turned toward the sound, squinting into the whiteout. A shape began to form about 20 feet away. A person, tall, broad-shouldered, walking toward me against the wind like it didn't affect them at all. Relief flooded through me so fast it almost made me dizzy. I shouted, but the wind tore my voice away before it could reach them. The figure raised an arm like they'd heard me anyway and kept coming. As they got closer, I noticed something strange. They weren't bundled up like anyone else would be in that storm. No bulky parka, no hood pulled tight, just a long, dark coat flapping slightly in the wind. When they were close enough to speak, the first thing they said made my stomach drop. "You shouldn't be out here." Their voice was calm. Too calm. I nodded, teeth chattering, and tried to explain about my car and the power outage, but the words came out slurred and broken. The cold was already getting to me more than I'd realized. The man, at least I assumed it was a man, looked past me into the storm, then back at my face. "There's a faster way," he said. "Come on." He turned and started walking, not waiting to see if I'd follow. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I didn't recognize him. In a town that small, you usually at least recognized faces, but the alternative was staying alone in the storm, and that wasn't really an option. I followed him. He moved with a strange confidence, like he knew exactly where he was going despite the whiteout. We walked for what felt like a long time. My legs were burning. My fingers were going numb. At one point, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. I looked down. I could see my own boots kicking through snow, but there were no tracks ahead of me. None behind him, just mine. I stopped walking. He stopped too, slowly turning to face me. "What's wrong?" he asked. I tried to ask him where we were going, but before I could finish the question, a powerful gust of wind tore through us, knocking me off balance. I stumbled, fell hard into the snow, and instinctively shut my eyes. When I opened them again, he was gone. No footprints, no silhouette fading into the storm. Just me, alone again, in the middle of a blizzard that suddenly felt much bigger than before. And that's when I realized I could see a light in the distance, one I definitely hadn't noticed until after he disappeared. This happened last January, during a blizzard that shut down almost the entire western side of Montana. I'm 29 now. But at the time, I was 27 and working seasonal construction jobs, moving wherever the work was. That winter, I was renting a small cabin outside a town called Plains. Calling it a town is generous. There was a gas station, a post office, and a bar that doubled as a grocery store if you showed up early enough. The cabin wasn't bad. It sat just off a Forest Service road, surrounded by pine trees that blocked most of the wind. I liked the isolation. It reminded me of growing up rural. Quiet, predictable. At least, that's what I thought. The storm was forecasted, but like most storms out there, people didn't take it seriously until it was already on top of them. The morning started with light snowfall. By early afternoon, the sky had turned that dull gray color that never means anything good. I was supposed to drive into town for supplies, but by the time I loaded up my truck, visibility had dropped so fast it didn't feel worth the risk. I decided to ride it out. That decision ended up saving my life. Around 6 p.m., the power went out. Not unusual. I lit a few candles, pulled on an extra layer, and settled in by the fireplace. The wind was loud, but the cabin held heat well enough. I figured I'd just sleep through the worst of it. At some point later that night, no idea what time, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. Knocking, not loud, not frantic, just slow, deliberate taps against the front door. I lay there for a moment, listening, trying to convince myself it was the wind throwing something against the cabin. But then it happened again. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I sat up in bed, suddenly very awake. No one should have been out there. The Forest Service road was barely passable on a good day. During a blizzard, it might as well not exist. Still, the idea of someone being stranded out there, freezing, made my chest tighten. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the front door. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I cracked the door just enough to peer outside. The snow was coming down hard, but I could make out a figure standing a few feet away. A woman, judging by her frame. She was hunched slightly, her back to me, hair plastered to her coat by snow. "Are you okay?" I asked. She turned slowly. Her face was pale, almost blue, like she'd been out in the cold for far too long. Snow clung to her eyelashes. Her eyes were unfocused, glassy. "My car won't start," she said. Her voice was quiet, flat. I saw the lights. I hesitated. Everything about her screamed hypothermia. The way she moved, the way she spoke. I knew enough to know that meant she needed warmth fast. So I unlatched the door and let her inside. The cold rushed in with her, followed by the smell of wet snow and pine. She didn't thank me. She just stood there, dripping onto the wooden floor, staring straight ahead. I offered her a blanket and guided her to a chair near the fireplace. She sat down stiffly, hands resting in her lap. As the warmth hit her, I expected her to start shivering violently, but she didn't. She barely reacted at all. "What's your name?" I asked. She didn't answer. I chalked it up to shock. I went to the kitchen to grab a mug and started heating water for tea. That's when I noticed something strange. The snow on the floor. There were wet footprints leading from the door to the chair. That was normal. What wasn't normal was that there were no footprints leading back to the door. Just a single set. Like she'd appeared inside rather than walked in. I told myself I was overthinking it. When I came back with the tea, she hadn't moved. She accepted the mug when I handed it to her, but she didn't drink. She just held it, staring into the steam. "Where's your car?" I asked gently. "I can call for help once the storm eases up." She finally looked at me then. "In the trees," she said. "It doesn't like the cold." Something about that phrasing made my skin prickle. Before I could ask what she meant, there was a loud crack outside. A tree limb snapping under the weight of snow. The sound made me flinch. When I looked back at her, she was smiling. It wasn't a warm smile. It was small, tight, like she was amused by something I wasn't aware of. "People don't come back for you in storms like this," she said. "They think you'll already be gone." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the sudden chill creeping up my spine. "Well, you're not gone," I said. "You're safe here." Her smile widened just a little. "That's what I thought too," she replied. The fire popped loudly. sending sparks up the chimney. The lights flickered for a moment, then went out completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness, broken only by the firelight. When I reached for my flashlight, I realized the chair across from me was empty. She was standing in the hallway instead. I hadn't heard her move. She was closer now, close enough that I could see her breath fogging the air between us. Except it wasn't fogging. It was perfectly clear, like the air around her was warmer than the rest of the room. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She tilted her head. "Back," she said. "It's getting crowded." I stepped back instinctively. "That's not a good idea," I said. "You need to stay here. You're not well." She looked past me, toward the front door. "The storm knows where I am," she said. "It always does." And then, without another word, she walked past me, opened the door, and stepped back into the blizzard. I stood there frozen, watching as the snow swallowed her whole in seconds. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I didn't sleep. I just sat by the fire until morning, replaying everything over and over. When the storm finally broke and daylight came, I went outside to look for her tracks. There were none. No footprints. No tire tracks. No sign anyone had ever been there. A week later, after telling the story at the bar in town, an older man pulled me aside. He asked me one question. Did she say the storm knew her? When I nodded, his face went pale. He told me that during bad winters, people sometimes saw her. Always during blizzards. Always asking to come inside. And anyone who followed her back into the storm was never found. I've gone back and forth for years about whether to tell this story. Not because it's unbelievable, but because once you hear it, you start noticing things you really shouldn't. Sounds in the wind, shapes in falling snow, patterns that were easier to ignore before. This happened 8 years ago, during what was officially labeled a once-in-a-generation blizzard. I was 35 at the time, living in North Dakota, about 20 minutes outside a town called Rugby. My wife and I had moved there for my job. She worked days. I worked nights. That schedule is important. The storm had been predicted for days. Schools closed. Roads shut down. Local authorities went door to door telling people to stay inside. By the time the blizzard actually hit, the world outside our house had vanished completely. White sky, white ground, no horizon. That night, my wife stayed with her sister in town because her car was already there. I stayed home to keep an eye on the house. We expected the power to go out eventually, but it didn't. At least, not at first. Around midnight, I was sitting in the living room when I heard something strange beneath the howling wind. Voices. At first, I thought it was the TV bleeding through the walls or maybe radio interference. But when I muted everything, they were still there. Faint, muffled, like people talking through layers of insulation. I stood up and walked toward the front door. The sound got clearer. It wasn't one voice. It was several. Men and women. Some crying. Some whispering. Some shouting. All coming from outside. I looked through the window, expecting to see people stranded in the road, but there was nothing. Just swirling snow. No movement. No shapes. The voices didn't stop. They weren't calling for help. That was the worst part. They were talking to each other, having conversations I couldn't quite understand. I grabbed my coat and boots before my common sense could catch up. I didn't open the door right away. I cracked it, just enough to listen. The sound rushed in immediately. It was unmistakable now. Human voices, dozens of them, all around the house. "Hello?" I shouted. The voices stopped. The silence afterward felt heavy, like pressure building in my ears. Then one voice answered, right outside my door. "Please," it said, "we're so cold." It sounded like a woman. Her voice was hoarse, weak, the kind of voice that comes from hours of screaming into the wind. I stepped back instinctively. "I'm calling for help," I said. "Stay where you are." There was a pause. Then the voice replied, calmer now, "They won't come." Something about the certainty in her tone made my hand shake. I shut the door and locked it. I moved from window to window, peering out into the storm. I still couldn't see anyone, but the voices were back. Louder now, closer. They were everywhere, at the sides of the house, behind it, on the roof. I could hear footsteps above me, slow dragging movements across the snow-packed shingles. That's when the power went out. The house fell into darkness, except for the faint glow of snowlight through the windows. The voices didn't stop. If anything, they multiplied. I backed into the center of the living room, heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. Then came the knocking. Not at the door, at the walls. Soft at first. Fingers tapping gently, patiently, like they were testing every surface. "Let us in. Please. You're warm." I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just coming from outside anymore. It felt like it was inside my head. Something thumped against the side of the house hard enough to shake the walls. Snow slid off the roof in heavy sheets. I don't know how long it went on. Time stopped meaning anything. I remember sinking to the floor, my back against the couch, whispering to myself that it wasn't real, that it was stress, wind, lack of sleep. At some point, I must have blacked out. I woke up to silence. Morning light filtered through the windows. The storm was over. I stayed on the floor for a long time before I dared to move. When I finally stood up, the house was exactly as I'd left it. No damage, no broken windows, no signs of anything unusual. I stepped outside. The snow around the house was pristine, smooth, untouched. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing. When my wife came home later that day, I didn't tell her what happened. I didn't want to scare her. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. That worked for about 2 weeks. Then I went into town to get groceries. While waiting in line, I overheard 2 older men talking about the storm. One of them mentioned how strange it was that the voices had come back. I froze. I asked him what he meant. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Every bad blizzard," he said. "People hear them, the ones who never made it home. Travelers, farmers, kids who got lost walking between houses decades ago." I asked him why no one talked about it. He shrugged. "Because listening too long makes you curious," he said, "and curiosity makes people open doors." We moved away from that house the following spring. I still live in a cold place. Winters are unavoidable for me, but whenever a blizzard hits now, I do one thing without exception. I turn on every light in the house, and no matter what I hear outside, I don't answer.